I want to start this conversation by just saying that I think the transition we're in the middle of, the revolution we're in the middle of, is actually a bureaucratic revolution. Of how we organize and relate to the world around us is the revolution. And that is the scale of what we're in the middle of. And that's changing our place and our relationship to the planet fundamentally. So it is very clear that at this moment in time, we're in the middle of a great war. A war between future generations, us terminating future generations, and us terminating our ecological context. That war has to be replaced by a great peace. And I would put forward to you that climate change is just a symptom of that war. It's a symptom. It's not the issue. What's at the issue, structurally at issue, is our relationship and the deep codes of how we've organized society and the world around us. Climate change is just one of many symptoms of those structural failures. And what we need to do is really deeply re-examine some of those deep codes of society that have been incredibly useful for us over the last 500 years. Over the last 500 years, our ways of seeing the world through objecthood, through distancing, classification, siloization, have been incredibly useful. And our mechanisms, our bureaucratic institutions, have built on those mechanisms of siloization, specialization, and have built the world around us. Yet now, those same tools and devices are feedbacking into us and driving self-terminization. And I think one of the rules, one of the kind of mechanisms and capacities of bureaucracies is to extend what it means to be human. I think we often think about rules as a containment of ourselves, but I think rules are an ennoblement. They invite us to be greater, invite us to be better humans. And that extension is a key capacity of operating in a world which is increasingly entangled. So I want to bring forth in this kind of conversation quite quickly a few ways, the way we see the world and why that's important. Why we need to transform the way we see the world. How do we see a nation? Do we see a nation as a red line boundary? Or do we see a nation as an entanglement of flow of ideas, power, money, material, resources? And if we see the world through an entanglement of flows, how do we then define, protect, enhance, and operate in that entanglement? Or do we draw a red line boundary and call it Brexit? How do we deal with effectively that entanglement, which means that single management paradigms, which are all based on optimization of one issue, one actor, work when actually you're dealing with complexity of issues? If you want to solve whether it's obesity or even youth unemployment issues, you're not going to solve it with one department. How do you organize change in that reality? How do you organize change when the impact of a private house, a poorly insulated private house, is felt by multiple government departments and multiple liabilities that are generated off the back of that? Is that a private house when it generates so many costs for different governmental departments? How do we understand trees? Trees are chopped down, certainly in many parts of the world, after about 10 years, because the insurance and the maintenance costs effectively after 10 years become too high. Yet the maturity, the ecological services value only really emerges after 40 years. So when our balance sheet models are fundamentally destroying the world around us, you start to see these problems. So if we're going to look at deep change, we have to change the way we see the world. Then we have to change where we organize in the world as well. Our theories of management were built out of military models, which are all about command and control. How do you control the world around you? Industrial theory was also based around control. How do you move from a world which is now increasingly perceived as entangled, highly complex and emergent, when our theories of organizing and bureaucracy are still built around worlds of centralized command and control systems? And whether the control systems can be centralized, the risk certainly is. So when something fails, it moves all the way up to the chancellery very quickly. So how do we deal with that reality? How do we deal with a world which isn't about single point optimization. If you optimize a tree just for carbons, what else do you lose out? So how do you live in a world of multi-optimizations? How do you work in that framework? How do you drive change? So our historic models of change are all based around representative models of change. Is that going to be possible in complex emergent environments? Does collective impact work when you get 15 different organizations in a boardroom together to be able to drive that change? Or do in democracies we have to build the system capacity for change, which is actually about empowering agency throughout the system to evolve, be conscious and interdependent? What does that mean in terms of building agency? What does that mean in terms of building innovation capacity, which is distributed, not centralized? What does it mean if you're going to drive systems change? System change is not about a portfolio of solutions. It's about fundamentally changing the capacity of a system to recognize itself, to change your models of accountability, to change your models of actually information systems, feedback systems. That's how systems change. You have to build the empowered capacity of the system, as opposed to building a portfolio of solutions with no actors on the front end. How do you do that in a way that's, firstly, just about coordination amongst multiple actors? How do you do that when it's about complex collaboration? And then how do you build that for synthesis? So if we're going to talk about democratic systems change, this is, I think, the key point I want to make. Democracies face violent change. Autocracies know how to do violent change. How are democracies going to deal with rapid scale change is the make or break issue. And for democracies to do that, we're going to have to distribute innovation capacity and care capacity across the whole system. So it's not sufficient for imagination to be held by bureaucrats or politicians. You have to build societal imagination. It's not sufficient for innovation to be done by a few people. It has to be a societal act. How do you build that societal agency and capacity to do that is critical. How do you build that capacity, which is to coordinate between the desire and the supply side and the regulation side and effectively the investment mechanisms? What are these new coordinating capacities required to be able to do that? So if that's the kind of theory of the complexity problems that we're facing, how do we contract into this future? And one of the things I want to sort of take away and let you hopefully take away is I think we're in a paradigm shift of how we contract with the world. Our economic model was based on the private contract. Contract between two parties, the private contract. What's changed is that we are now able to do contract between multiple parties, many to many. When you go from private contracting to many contracting, you change the nature of the economy from private to a civic economy. That capacity as a result of looking at machine contracting capability, I think changes the nature of how value is structured. So if you look at an urban forest or a city canopy, you can look at how a whole city canopy of urban forests, which is made up by citizens, can actually contribute to collective goods and collective infrastructures. How do we drive that? Those ability to contract those values is now possible and thereby creates new forms of actually economic value. How do we look at value which is not only about actually the cost base of looking at the impacts of failure, but looking at thriving? How do we value thriving in that economy? How do we look at moving from specialization economies, which are focused on single point optimizations, to multiple co-benefits economies? And these are now contractually viable. How do you move beyond that into care economies? We know care is the big issue. You cannot value care. So as the Russian military has found, you can buy the equipment, but you can't take care of the tires. Right? Care is priceless in a system. How do you actually value that and structure that? How do you move all the way through kind of these many processes? But I think what these processes dictate up there, centralized, fixed, control, object, bound, these were all about the analog world. When you start to look at the world through a digital capability and a parametric capability perspective, you build fundamentally a different bureaucracy. A bureaucracy that's able to be parametric. that's able to be contingent, that's able to look at value across many-to-many actors. That, I think, is a deep revolution of our bureaucracy. And in Germany, the first generation of industrial bureaucracy was built here. I think we're now facing a next generation of bureaucracy, which is structurally different. And that changes how we see the world. So land ownership was actually a means of control of land, and control was the best way of stewardship. How's that evolved? Still, we've gone from passive land to abstracted land, and increasingly what we're seeing is revolutions in even ownership in terms of self-owning lands. So we're seeing land being recognized as an agent, as an actor in itself. And this stuff is already happening. Rivers being made self-sovereign, forests being made self-sovereign. What does that do to our changing nature of our relationship with the world? That is no longer about man or humans being dominion in control of the world, but being in treaty with the world. So everything around you becomes agent and of care. Everything around you. So you don't own, but you borrow from the world. Some places have to be forgotten and put outside our control. Nationhood perhaps isn't restricted to a red line boundary. What happens if forests govern themselves? Buildings own themselves. Cars own themselves. What if the camera owns itself? I think that's the bureaucratic revolution we're in the middle of, and it will change our relationship with everything around us, both future, past, and present. With that, I thank you.